2 days without water, light, or mercy, until a chief heard her breathing. The first thing I found of her was a boot. Not her, the boot. It was half buried in the red clay at the bottom of the draw, one spur still attached, spinning slow in the thin wind that came off the flat before sundown. I don't know why I stopped for it. I'd been riding since before first light, and my horse was tired, and I had water for maybe another day if I was careful, and there was no reason a man in my condition should stop for a stranger's boot in a dry creek bed. No reason at all. But I stopped. I have thought about that moment many times since. What makes a man pull up when everything in him says ride on? It's not always wisdom. It's not always instinct. Sometimes it's something that doesn't have a name, and you just let it work on you, and later, if things go a certain way, you call it the thing that changed everything. And if things go another way, you call it a foolish waste of time, and you probably don't think about it much at all. I got down from the horse. My knees took the landing the way they always do now, a little slower than they used to, a little more deliberate. The clay smelled like iron and old rain, the kind of smell that means a storm came through days ago and baked everything hard after. I crouched and picked up the boot. It was a woman's boot. Small, with a pointed toe, the leather cracked across the toe box, but stitched fine. Somebody had paid good money for those boots once. The spur was brass, not iron. I turned it over in my hands. The heel was worn on the outside the way a person's heel wears when they walk with their weight to the outside of their foot. I looked at the spur again, still turning slow in the wind that came through the draw like a held breath finally let go. Then I heard it. Not much, barely anything. A sound like a small animal makes when it's been still so long it's almost stopped bothering to breathe. The edge of a sound. I turned my head and looked up the bank. She was maybe 12 feet above me, tucked into a shelf of rock where the clay wall had caved and left a hollow. Her other boot was gone. Her feet were bare, and one of them was the color of ripe plum from mid-arch to ankle. She had her face turned to the stone and both hands pressed flat against it, like she was trying to push herself through to the other side. Her hair had come most of the way down from wherever it had been pinned, and was stuck to the side of her face in dark strands. I stood there. I'm not a man who panics. I don't say that to flatter myself, it's just true, the way some men are left-handed or have poor eyesight. Since I was a boy, I have been the kind of man who goes quiet when something bad happens. My mother said it used to frighten her when I was small, the way I'd go still instead of cry. My uncle, the chief I learned from, said it was a quality the spirits put in certain men because those men were going to need it. I don't know what it is. But I stood there in that dry creek bottom, and I looked up at that woman, and I didn't move for what felt like a long time, and it wasn't because I didn't know what to do. It was because something in me recognized what I was looking at and needed a moment with it. A person at the end of something. I had seen it before. On the plains after a bad winter when the old people give out and the young ones have to figure out what to do with the bodies before the ground freezes. On the trail after the long marches that I don't talk about except to my nephew, who needs to understand them so he doesn't let them happen again. I had seen a person at the end of their thread, and I knew the particular quality of stillness it had, the way a body conserves itself when it's down to almost nothing. The way a person stops spending energy on anything but the one essential work of staying. She was spending herself on staying. I climbed the bank. My name is Tahaka Shunka. In English that becomes something like dog chasing elk, which nobody called me except the old men when I was young, and they wanted to remind me who I came from. Most people who knew me called me Tak, which is not a name but a shortened sound. The kind of nickname a man gets from people who don't want to work very hard at his actual name. I had answered to it for so long it had become its own thing, separate from the name my father gave me, its own small history. I was 47. I had been chief of a small band of Lakota for 11 years, since my uncle died and there was nobody else the old men trusted. I say small band and I mean small, 31 people by the last count. and some of those were children and old women, and one very old man who might or might not be able to survive another winter, which was a thing I thought about more than I let on. We were not the band we had been. The years since the war with the Bluecoats had taken people from us in ways that didn't stop just because the fighting did. Sickness, hunger. Men who drifted away and didn't come back, not because they wanted to leave, but because the leaving was easier than watching the thing shrink. There were other bands, larger ones, men I knew who led 4 times our number and had 4 times our problems and didn't always look like they were winning. I had come to this part of the territory alone. That wasn't unusual. I did that sometimes, took my horse and rode out for a few days when there were things I needed to think through without everyone watching to see what expression I wore while I thought them. The watching was constant. I had come to understand it as part of what it meant to be the one people depended on. They needed to read your face for information, and I didn't begrudge them that. But it meant that when I needed to think through something difficult, I had to do it somewhere they couldn't see me do it. Because some thoughts need the face to work through them, and a chief can't afford to let his people watch him be uncertain. There were decisions I was being pushed toward. Decisions about the land and the agency, and the men in suits who kept coming with papers, and the kind of reasonable-sounding language that meant something entirely different from what it said. The kind of decisions a man should not make when other people's hope is visible on their faces, and you know whatever you choose they will trust it because you're the one who's choosing. That trust is not a weight I take lightly. It never has been, but it does make it harder to think. I had been alone for 4 days when I found the boot. I climbed the bank and crouched beside her. Up close she was worse than she'd looked from below. Her lips were cracked so deep they'd bled and dried, and in the dried blood there was a trace of red that told me it hadn't been long enough for it to go fully brown. Her face was the color of saddle leather that's been left in the weather, and she'd lost a lot of water through her skin in the heat. I could see it in the way her flesh had gone tight over the bones of her hands. Her knuckles looked like knuckles on a woman 10 years older than she was. But she was breathing. I put my hand near her face and felt it, small and ragged, coming and going. I said something to her in Lakota. I don't remember what exactly. Something low, the way you talk to an animal that's been hurt and is afraid of you. Something that said, I'm here and I see you and I'm not going to do anything fast. Her eye opened. One eye. The other was swollen, partly shut, either from the sun or from a fall, I couldn't tell yet. The open eye was brown, and it had dried matter in the corner, and it focused on me with tremendous effort. The way a thing focuses when everything else has been stripped away, and there's only the one essential job left. See what's in front of you. She didn't speak, she just looked. I got my water skin. I'd been rationing it for 2 days, taking only what I needed, not what I wanted. I wasn't going to ration now. I uncapped it and put it to her lips and tipped it slow, holding the back of her head with my other hand, letting her take a little at a time because you can make a person sick giving them too much too fast when they're this dry. She didn't try to grab it the way some will. She was past that kind of urgency and into something quieter, some more essential layer where you just take what comes and try to keep it down. She drank, swallowed carefully, lay still. Her eye was still on me. I gave her a little more. Then I capped the skin and sat back on my heels and looked at her ankle. It was the right one and it was bad. Not just swollen, the angle wasn't right. The slight deviation I could see even through the swelling that told me the bone had shifted. She hadn't walked anywhere on that ankle. She'd gotten to this hollow and stayed. I looked at the sky, maybe 2 hours of good light left. There was a canyon 7, maybe 8 miles north where I'd camped 2 nights ago, where a spring came up from the rock and there was good shade in the afternoon and enough wood for fires. That was the water. That was what she needed most, more than anything else, water and shade and something to eat, and then rest and time for the body to come back from where it had been. The ankle needed to be set and immobilized. I could do both of those things. I had done them before, not under good conditions and not always successfully, but I had done them. Getting her there was the problem. 8 miles with a broken ankle on horseback with a woman who had almost no reserves left. It was possible. It was going to be hard on her. 2 days without water, I would learn later. She'd had a little food, dried meat she'd carried in a coat pocket. But the water had run out somewhere around the first evening, and everything after that was thirst and heat, and the long shrinking of a person down to almost nothing. The ankle was broken. She'd done it coming off a horse in the dark, the animal shying at something in the brush, and she'd gone down on the rocks at the edge of the draw and felt the snap before she'd even finished falling and known immediately what it meant out here, miles from anything, after dark, alone. She'd crawled to the hollow. The crawling had taken most of what she had left. She'd been in the hollow for 2 days in the shade of the rock, trying not to move. I learned all of this over the days that followed. Right then I knew only what I could see. A woman alive at the end of what she had, and an 8-mile ride and 2 hours of light. I went back down to the horse and got my blanket and one of the 2 flat pieces of kindling I carried for fires, and a length of cord I kept in the saddlebag. I came back up the bank and I set the ankle. Before I did it, I told her in English what I was going to do once plainly, without making it softer than it was. She listened. She nodded. When I did it, she made one sound through her teeth. A short, controlled sound. The kind you make when you're giving the pain a place to go but not letting it take over, and then went quiet and held still for the rest of it, which told me something about her that I held on to. I wrapped the ankle with the cord over the kindling, working carefully, checking the tension at each pass. I had a spare shirt in the saddlebag and I cut strips from the hem to use as padding under the lashing where the cord would dig. She watched me work the entire time, that single brown eye tracking my hands, not afraid exactly, or not only afraid, something else alongside the fear, considering, evaluating. When I was done I said, "I'm going to put you on my horse. There's a canyon north of here with a spring. We'll camp there." She said in a voice like a hinge that hadn't been used in a long time, a voice that cost something to produce, "All right." That was the first word she said to me. I lifted her. She was light in a way that bothered me, not the lightness of a small person but the lightness of someone who has been reduced. The weight loss of 2 days of nothing, the way the body uses itself when it has no other option. I got her up onto the horse and I walked, leading the animal by the bridle, and we started north while there was still light enough to pick a line through the country. She stayed upright for about half a mile. Then she leaned forward over the horse's neck and held on to the mane, and I don't think she was entirely conscious for the last part of the ride, though she didn't fall. Some part of her was still doing the work of holding on even when the rest of her was elsewhere. I had my hand on her back for the last mile, walking beside the horse in the dark with my arm up, keeping her centered. The horse was patient. He had always been a patient animal, more so than I sometimes felt I deserved. We reached the canyon as the stars were coming out. Full dark by the time we were in under the walls, and the spring sound came to me before I could see anything. That small, steady sound that the water made coming up from the rock, and I had not realized until that moment how long it had been since I'd heard it. 2 days at least. I had been moving away from water, across dry country, thinking about papers and men in suits, and 31 people waiting for me to come back with answers. The sound of the spring in the dark did something to my chest that I didn't have a word for. There is a particular quality to that canyon at night that I have never been able to explain properly to anyone who wasn't there. The rock holds the day's warmth after sunset, and the spring makes a sound in the quiet that is very small and very steady, and the stars are not separate points of light the way they look from the open. They are thick, like something has been scattered across the black and not bothered to be careful about it. I have slept under those stars 4 or 5 times over the years, and I have always felt, waking up there in the dark, that I was in a place that was old and not indifferent. I made camp. I got a fire going, small, and I got her settled near it, her back against a rounded boulder that would hold the warmth. I gave her more water slowly, a little at a time, and I had dried meat and some hard bread, and she ate a little of each and kept it down. I had her ankle elevated on my saddlebag. I checked the binding in the firelight, pressing gently at 2 points to see whether the swelling had changed. It had, but not for the worse. The bone had stayed where I'd put it. She was watching me. I said, "What's your name?" She said, Marin Voss." I said, "Where were you going?" She thought about it, not like she didn't know, like she was deciding how much to say. Finally she said, "There's a settlement, Calhoun Wells." I was trying to reach it. "That's 3 days' ride from here, south." "I know that now." I looked at the fire. She said, "Where am I?" "Dry Rock Canyon. The Lakota know it as Kankusunka, the Dog's Road. It's a good camp. There's the spring, and the rock holds heat at night." I could hear something. Water. When you were setting my ankle, I thought I was imagining it. "You weren't. It comes up from underground. It runs all year." She turned her head a little toward the sound, even though we were too far from it for her to hear it clearly from here, as if she wanted to acknowledge it, as if it deserved acknowledgement after what she'd been through for the lack of it. She said after a while, "You're the one who found me." "Yes." "Why did you stop?" She looked at me. "You could see I was in the draw. You had water, not much, I'd guess, but you were being careful with it. You could have passed by." I thought about the boot, the spinning spur. I said, "I don't know." She looked at me for a long moment with those brown eyes, and the firelight was in them, and she didn't push it further. She didn't say, "I'm glad you did," or "thank you," or any of the things a person says when they're trying to paper over something they don't know how to hold. She just accepted the not knowing and let it be there between us. That was the second thing I noticed about her. She knew when to leave something alone. She slept after that. A hard, long sleep, the kind the body demands when it's been running on nothing for too long and the threat is finally past. I sat by the fire and listened to her breathe and thought about things that had nothing to do with her, and then, gradually, about things that did. My name, when my father gave it to me, was meant to say something about persistence. A dog chasing an elk doesn't catch the elk, not usually. The elk is bigger, faster, built for it. But the dog keeps going. My father said it was the best kind of name a man could have, a name that was about the keeping on rather than the catching. I used to think he meant it as encouragement. By the time I was 30, I understood that he also meant it as a description of what he saw in me. I had a wife once, Tehan Win. She died 4 years ago, a fever that took her in a week, the kind of fast loss that doesn't seem real until you've been alone long enough for it to stop not being real and become just the shape of your life. We had no children. It wasn't for the lack of wanting them, and it was a grief we both carried quietly, not something we talked about much because some things are better carried in the doing rather than in the saying. We had 11 years together and they were good years. Not easy, nothing about those years was easy, for anyone, and we had our share of the difficulty. But good in the way that things are good when the person beside you is genuinely the person you would have chosen if you'd been able to look at all the people in the world and choose. When she was gone, I was not lost exactly. I still had the band. I still had the decisions. I still had every morning waking up and being needed, which is not nothing. Being needed is not the same as being valued, but it keeps you from disappearing into yourself. But there was something that had been in me when she was alive that was not in me anymore, and I had come to think of that absence as just a fact, the way a missing finger is a fact. You learn to do with it what you can. You stop reaching for things with a hand that isn't there. I sat by that fire and listened to a woman breathe and thought about my wife. Not because of Marin, I didn't know her yet, not enough to make that kind of connection. It was more that something about the day had shifted something in me, like a piece of ground that's been dry a long time and then gets rained on and the surface changes. Not much, but it changes, and whatever had shifted was making space for things I'd stopped thinking about. The fire burned down and I built it back up. The canyon was quiet except for the spring. A nighthawk went over somewhere above the rim, its wings making the sound they make, a cut through the air, and then nothing. I did not sleep that night. There is a particular work to keeping watch over someone who has come close to dying. It's not the watching itself. I have stood watch many times, over camp perimeters, over sick children, over old men in their last nights. What's different is the quality of attention it demands, the way you find yourself calibrating constantly to the sound of their breathing, noting each slight change, each deepening or shallowing, the way the body works through its crisis in the dark. She breathed steadily. After the first hour, I could hear the sleep doing its work. The breath became more regular, the small unconscious movements stilled, and she was down in it, in the deep place where the body does its repairs without needing to be conscious of doing them. I sat with the fire and thought about things. I thought about my uncle, who had taught me everything I knew about sitting still when sitting still was what was needed. He was a patient man. Not a soft man. Patience is not softness. It's one of the hardest things there is. He had lived his patience in a particular way, which was that he never spent himself on things that were going to be decided by time anyway. He said there were decisions a man could make and decisions that were going to make themselves, and the skill was knowing which was which, and not wasting your strength on the ones that were going to go their own way. I had been out here trying to figure out which kind this was. The papers, the agency, the arrangement they were pushing us toward. I had been treating it as the first kind, a decision I had to make, with right and wrong answers, with cost-benefit to weigh and alternatives to consider, and a clear moment where I would stand up and say this and not that, and that would be the thing. And it was that, partly. But sitting by that fire, I began to understand that the decision had already been made, had been made by everything that had happened to us over the last 30 years, by what my uncle chose and what his uncle chose before him, and by the shape of the world as it had come to be. The only question was whether I was going to say it out loud in a way that left my people something to stand on. The deciding was not about the papers. It was about the saying. She turned in her sleep, a small movement. She resettled, and the breathing went on. I put another stick on the fire. I thought about my wife, about the specific quality of night she used to make, the way she breathed when she was fully asleep, which was heavier than this woman's breath, deeper. She was a deep sleeper who went all the way down and came back slowly. I thought about how long it had been since I'd sat in the dark with someone sleeping nearby, and how different it felt from sleeping alone. Not just the presence, but the responsibility of it, the fact of another person whose safety was your business. I had not realized until that night how much of myself had contracted in those 4 years. How small the circle of my care had gotten, pulled in tight around the band and the decisions and the work, with nothing left over for the small particular care of a single person nearby. She was not my person. I had known her for less than a day, but she was in my camp and she was sleeping and I was the one keeping the fire. It was enough, for now it was enough. I kept the fire going and the water skin filled from the spring, and I watched the canyon walls lighten from black to gray to the color of rust as the sun came up behind the east wall. And when she woke, I had water ready and more food, and a poultice I'd put together from some plants I knew, pressed between 2 pieces of cloth and wrapped around the outside of the binding to pull some of the heat out of the ankle. It wasn't sophisticated medicine, but it was what I had, and it was better than nothing. She woke slowly, the way people wake after a sleep that deep, not from one level but from many, surfacing through each one. She opened her eyes and looked at the canyon walls and then at the sky and then at me. She said, "You were up all night." "Yes." "You didn't have to do that." I didn't say anything to that. She sat up. She moved carefully, checking herself. Her hand went to her ankle and she felt the binding without pulling at it, just touching the surface of it. She said, "You've done this before." "A few times." "It's tight but not too tight. And this," she touched the padding under the lashing, the strips of cloth I'd put there to protect the skin, "this is deliberate." Someone showed you this. My uncle. He was the one who knew medicine in our band. He died 11 years ago. She looked at me, and you've been the one since. I've been the chief since. The medicine is what I learned from him. It's not the same thing. But you're the one they go to. I said, I'm the one who tries to know enough of what I need to know. She looked at her ankle again. I could see her taking inventory, the binding, the poultice, the elevation, the camp. She was putting together the picture of what had been done for her while she slept and doing the accounting of it without sentimentality, taking it in as fact. She said, I can't walk on this, not properly. No, not for days. How long before I can ride? If I splint it properly and the bone holds, you might manage a slow ride in 4 or 5 days. If you push it sooner, you risk it moving and will have to start over. She absorbed that. The calculation was visible in her face, not impatience exactly, more the pragmatic reckoning of a person who needs to know the facts before she can plan. She looked at the canyon, at the spring sound coming from the north end, at the fire. She said, what are you doing out here? Before you found me, you weren't just passing through. I ride out alone sometimes, to think. A long way from your band. That's the point. She looked at me, what do you think about? Out here. I said, you should eat something before you start asking questions. She almost smiled, not quite. Is that your way of saying mind your own business? It's my way of saying you've had nothing real to eat in 2 days, and your body needs fuel before it needs conversation. She ate. I watched her do it carefully, taking small amounts, chewing thoroughly, not rushing even though I could see that she was hungry, genuinely hungry, the deep hunger that comes when the body has been without for long enough that it stops signaling normally, and then all at once comes roaring back. She was disciplined about it. She did what was needed and not what was wanted. When she had finished as much as I thought was wise for the first meal back, she drank more water and then leaned back against the boulder and looked at the sky. The canyon was in shadow still, the sun not yet high enough to clear the east wall, and the morning was cool with that dry coolness that makes the air feel thin and clean. She said, Marin Voss. My husband was Frank Voss. He died 8 months ago. I was trying to reach my sister in Calhoun Wells. I waited. She said, I sold everything we had, the claim, the equipment, the 2 mules, and I started riding. I had enough money to get there if I was careful and didn't run into trouble. You were riding alone. I didn't have enough money to hire anyone, and she paused. I didn't want to wait any longer. I had been waiting for 2 years. I was done waiting. I looked at her. What were you waiting for? She looked at the rock above us. For things to work out the way Frank believed they would. The claim was played out. I knew it was played out. Frank didn't or wouldn't, and I wasn't going to. She stopped. We didn't fight. I waited. And when he died, I stopped waiting. I thought about that. I said, that took a long time. 8 months and 2 years before that. That's a long time to know something and not be able to act on it. She held my eyes. He was my husband. I know. She looked away. He was good, she said. Not smart about the land, but good. He tried. He believed in things harder than the evidence supported, but that wasn't meanness, it was hope. He was a man who needed hope the way some people need light. If I had taken it away from him by being right, I would have taken him. I said, and you weren't willing to do that. No. I looked at the fire. I said, that's not a flaw. She looked at me, and something in her expression shifted, something small and deep, like a thing that had been held in a particular position for a long time and suddenly had permission to move. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with those brown eyes. The second day in the canyon, she slept most of the morning and sat up in the afternoon. The color had begun to come back to her face. The deep cracking on her lips had started to ease. She ate more at midday and kept it down, and she drank steadily, not desperately, taking in water the way the ground takes in rain after a dry spell, steady absorption, nothing wasted. I had gone out in the morning and come back with some chokecherries I'd found not far up the canyon wall, not many, but some. She ate them one at a time, sitting in the shade, her bad ankle out in front of her, her good foot flat on the ground. She watched me work. I had been watched before. Everyone watches the chief. It is part of the job. But the watching I was used to was a particular kind. It was watching for information, watching to see which way the wind was going to go, watching to read the outcome of a thing before the outcome became visible. That watching has a quality of tension in it, a leaning forward, an anxiety underneath. Her watching was different. She watched the way someone watches a thing they find interesting for its own sake, the way you watch a river or a hawk or a fire, because the thing itself is worth watching and you want to understand how it works. There was nothing in it that wanted anything from me. She was just paying attention fully, the way she seemed to pay attention to everything. I found it easier to move in than most watching. Easier, oddly, to be precise, because precision was visible to her, and she seemed to understand what it meant. I checked the rope tension on the kindling splint and I could see her noting the check, understanding without being told that it was a check and why it mattered. I got water from the spring and I came back and she noted how much I brought, and I could see her calculating how long it would last, and comparing that to what she estimated our situation required. She was doing all the time what I was doing, accounting for the situation, staying oriented. I had noticed this the first night, but it became clearer as the days passed. She watched everything. The way I moved through the camp, the choices I made about wood and fire and water, how I read the sky at the end of the afternoon to see what the night would bring. Most people, when they're injured and being cared for, turn inward. They get absorbed in their own recovery. She didn't do that. She paid attention to the outside world with the same full attention she seemed to bring to everything. On the second afternoon, I had gone to the canyon mouth to check the southern trail, and when I came back she was sitting exactly where I'd left her, but her posture had changed. She was straighter, more present. She said, "You're looking for someone." I said, "Just checking the trail." "You've done it twice today, and yesterday evening. There are men who use this canyon who are not good men. I like to know if they're coming." She looked at me. "Would they bother us, a camp like this?" "Maybe, maybe not. They'd be more likely to leave it alone if they knew whose camp it was." She absorbed that. Then she said, "So you have a reputation in this country. Some men know who I am. Whether that makes them more cautious or less depends on the man." She said, "It's useful, though. That they know. When it is, I let it be." She nodded, that flat, practical nod. She said, "Is that why you come out here alone? Not just to think, but also to remind them you're here?" She was closer to the truth than I wanted to immediately confirm. I said, "I come out here to think. The reminding is something that happens while I'm thinking." "What are you thinking about?" I looked at her for a moment. It was a direct question. The kind you don't usually get from someone in her situation. Most people who have been rescued are careful. They stay on the safe side of things. They ask small questions and accept small answers and save the real ones for later when they're back on their feet and have less to be grateful for. She asked it the way a person asks something they actually want to know. I came and sat down near the fire across from her, and I told her. It took a while. The agency, the papers, the arrangement they were pushing us toward, and what it would mean and what the alternatives were and why none of them were simple. The band, the 31 people, the specific weight of being the one they looked to. I told her about the negotiations that had been going on for 2 years, and the point we'd come to where I was being asked to make a decision that would determine the shape of the next decade. And I had come out here because I needed to make it somewhere that the hope on people's faces wasn't visible to me, because their hope made it harder for me to see clearly. She listened all the way through. She didn't nod along or make sounds of understanding or do any of the things people do when they're listening with part of themselves and filling in the rest with their own thoughts. She was just there, taking it in. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. The fire made its sound. The spring made its sound from the north end of the canyon. Then she said, "What does your gut say?" I said, "My gut says they're going to take it one way or another. The question is whether I give them a reason that lets my people hold their heads up afterward." She nodded slowly. "That sounds like you already know." Knowing and being willing to live with what you know are different things. "Yes," she said. "They are." She said it flat and certain, like she was confirming something she'd learned from experience, like the confirmation came from a place in her that had been lived in. I looked at her. She said, "I knew 8 months ago that the claim was finished. We'd been working it for 2 years and it had given us nothing and it wasn't going to give us anything. I knew that. My husband didn't. He believed in it the way some men believe in things, not with evidence but with his whole chest, and you can't argue with that kind of belief. So I stopped arguing. I waited. And when he died," she stopped. She looked at the fire. "When he died, the knowing and the being able to act on what I knew finally became the same thing. It was the worst 6 months of my life. And then I got on a horse. The ankle wasn't part of the plan." She looked at me with that almost not quite smile. "No, the ankle was not part of the plan." I said, "But the getting on the horse was right." She looked at me for a moment. She looked at her ankle. She looked back at me. She said, "Yes, even with all this, the getting on the horse was right." The third day she was on her feet. Not walking, she'd bear a little weight on the bad ankle with her hand on the canyon wall, but only a little, testing it carefully, not pushing past what it would give. But she was upright, which was different from the first 2 days in ways that mattered. She stood differently. Her head was up. She was inhabiting herself again. In the afternoon, we sat in the shade at the south end of the canyon, where the walls opened a little, and let the afternoon light in sideways, golden and thick, the kind of light that makes the red rock look like it's lit from inside. She had asked me in the morning if I would show her how to pack a camp correctly. Not the packing itself, but the organization of it, why you put things in a certain order, what logic governed the placement of things in a saddlebag when you were going to need to get to them in the dark or in a hurry. I'd spent the morning walking her through it. She was on her feet at the mouth of the lean-to, her hand on the wall for balance, watching me lay things out and explain the sequence. I explained it once, went through it, and then I undid it all and asked her to try it. She went through it from the beginning. She made 2 small adjustments from what I'd shown her, and when I looked at them I saw they were actually improvements. She had looked at the logic I'd given her and extended it slightly. I told her so. She said, "It makes more sense that way. If you need to get to the cord in the dark, you want it on the outside, not buried." I said, "Yes." She said, "You do it the other way from habit." My uncle taught me. I've done it that way for 30 years. Habits are hard to see, especially good ones. I looked at her. She was not performing anything, just saying what was true. She absorbed the logic immediately, the way someone absorbs something they already understand and are just now getting the right language for. She asked good questions, not many, and not vague, but specific and practical. Why this before that? What happens if the weight shifts? How do you account for what you'll need versus what you'll want? By mid-morning she was doing it herself with me watching, and she was getting it right. Now she was going through the saddlebag a second time, slower, thinking about it with her hands. She said without looking up, "Tell me about your wife." I was not expecting that. She looked up then, and her face said she knew she was asking something that might not be welcome, but she didn't take it back. She just looked at me with those brown eyes and waited to see what I'd do. I said her name was Tehan Win. "What does that mean?" "It means something like a yellow woman or a tawny woman. The color of the prairie in late summer, when the grass has gone from green to gold and it's not quite any one color. Was she that color? I thought about it honestly. Her skin, yes, and her eyes in a certain light, not brown, not amber, something between. She had a way of looking at things as if she was deciding whether they were worth her time, and mostly she decided they were, and that was a gift she had. She didn't waste anger. She didn't waste worry. She spent herself on things that mattered, and the rest she set aside. Marin was quiet. She had stopped going through the saddlebag and was holding a coil of rope without uncoiling it, just holding it. I said she would have liked this canyon. How long ago? 4 years. She nodded. She looked out at the light on the rock. After a while she said, "My husband was a good man, not always a wise one, but good. He tried hard, he was faithful, he was kind to me even when things weren't going well." She paused. "I miss him less than I thought I would. That makes me feel terrible, but it's true." I said, "You knew what was coming for a long time before it came. You grieved ahead." She looked at me. "Is that what I did?" "People do. They don't always know they're doing it." She was quiet. She put the coil of rope back in the saddlebag exactly where it went. She said, "My sister thinks I should find someone in Calhoun Wells. She has someone in mind, a man who runs the grain store, stable, reliable, solid prospects." She paused. She described him for 3 paragraphs in her last letter. "He sounds very boring." "You don't know that. I know the type of person my sister considers a good match for me. She thinks I need someone who will manage things, who will take the decisions off my hands, because she believes I've been making decisions for too long and it has worn me out." I said, "Has it?" She looked at me directly. "No." I didn't say anything. She said, "I am good at decisions. I am very good at decisions. I was good at them when Frank was alive, and I made most of them for us whether or not that was acknowledged, and I have been good at them since he died, and I have been making all of them. The thing that will be different about my life in Calhoun Wells compared to my life before is not that someone else will take over the decisions. The thing that will be different is that I will have company while I make them." I looked at her. She met my eyes. Something in her face that was not the evaluation and not the watching, but something underneath those, something more personal, less composed. She said, "I don't want to be managed. I would rather be alone than be managed." She said it quietly, without heat. It was not a complaint or a declaration. It was a fact about herself that she had worked out somewhere and was now saying plainly. I had met a few women like that in my life. My wife had some of it, though she came at things differently. There was a woman in another band I had known years ago, a widow who ran her own affairs, who had that quality too, that particular self-possession that comes from having been tested and having found out what you are made of. They were not difficult women. They were not combative. They just knew what they were, and they had stopped apologizing for it. This one had come to it through the years of waiting, through knowing the vein went east and not being able to go east, through the discipline of staying, which took as much strength as leaving would have, maybe more, because leaving is over quickly and staying goes on. She had spent herself on the staying, and the staying had left her clear. That's not the same as wanting to be alone. She held my eyes. I looked away at the canyon wall, at the light going sideways across it. That night I cooked properly. I had gone out in the late afternoon and found sign of rabbits not far from the south end of the canyon, and come back with 2 of them. I had salt and a little dried sage in the pack, and the fire was hot and clean by the time I started. She sat close to the fire with the blanket around her shoulders and watched me cook, and I let her watch. She had been watching me for 3 days, and I had stopped feeling observed and started feeling accompanied, which was a different thing entirely. We ate without talking much. The food was good. It was the kind of simple thing that tastes like what it is when you're in a place like that, in the dark with a good fire, and the canyon walls close, and the stars doing their work overhead. After the meal she said, "Do you ever talk to her, your wife?" "Sometimes." "What do you say?" I thought about it honestly. I tell her what's happening, the decisions, the band. I tell her what the country looks like, what season it is. She liked to know where things stood. "Does it help?" "It helps me feel less like I'm making things up as I go." She laughed, quiet, real, not polite, not performed. It came up out of her quick and surprised her, and she put her hand over her mouth for a second, and then let it go. "That's a good reason," she said. "She had better ones," I said. "She talked to her mother the same way after her mother died. She said it was a way of carrying the person forward. She said the dead don't stop being part of the conversation just because they've stopped being able to answer." Marin was quiet, looking at the fire. She said, "I don't talk to Frank. I've tried. I can't find the voice of him in my head. Maybe because we didn't talk enough when he was alive. We worked alongside each other. We did things. But the talking, it wasn't something he was built for, and it wasn't something I pushed for." "And now you push for it." She looked at me, a pause. "I suppose I do." We talked until late that night, later than we had the other nights. We talked about the canyon and the band and the specific difficulty of being the person others rely on when you have your own losses to carry. We talked about the claim and what it had looked like, the hills and the specific quality of light in mining country, the way the rock there is different from the rock here. She knew things about the earth that most women I'd encountered didn't bother knowing, and she talked about them precisely, the way she talked about everything. She told me about the vein, how she'd seen it before Frank had, how she'd tracked it in her head for months against what the digging was showing them, and how the numbers never reconciled. She said, "I told him twice, just twice." I said, "Frank, the vein goes east and we are north and west of where it is." He nodded. He looked at the maps. He said I might be right. And then the next morning he was in the same hole he'd always been in. She was looking at the fire. So I stopped saying it. "What would you have done if it had been yours to decide?" "Gone east, flat, certain, no hesitation. Sold the 2 mules, hired 1 more man with the money, gone east, found the vein, made money, built something." You could see it that clearly. I can read the rock. Frank couldn't. He was good with the equipment, good at the physical work of it, but the reading, the actual reading, what the ground is telling you about what's underneath, he didn't have that. I did. I looked at her. She said, "That's not a criticism of him. It's just what was true." "I know." She looked at me. "You keep saying things like that, as if what's true is just what's true and doesn't need to be defended or apologized for." I said, "Doesn't it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "No, I suppose it doesn't." We talked for a long time that night, more than the other nights. Something had come loose between us during the saddlebag work and the question about my wife, and the conversation ran easier, less careful, the way water runs after it finds its channel. She told me about the hills where the claim was, the specific quality of that country, drier than here, the rock different, sedimentary where this country is mostly granite and sandstone. She described the view from the mouth of the shaft they dug, which was east-facing, and caught the morning light in a way that made the whole valley below look like a different place than it was in the afternoon. She had a way of describing the land that was less about what she saw and more about how the land felt. The way you know a place not just by looking, but by the quality of air it holds, and the sound it makes, and the particular resistance of the ground under your feet. I told her about the Whitetail Fork and the camp, and the specific hardship of the winters there, which were harder than most people expected that far south. We had lost 2 people the previous winter to a cold snap that came late in March, which is the worst time, when you've already spent your reserves and the spring seems close enough to touch, and then the cold comes back like it's making a point. She said 2 people. An old man and a child. The old man was expected, the child wasn't. She didn't say anything to that. She just let it be there, the way she let most things be. But I could see that she took it in, put it somewhere careful. After a while she said, "It's not just decisions, is it? What you carry?" "No. It's all of them, the people themselves." "Yes." She looked at the fire. "That's why you need to come out here alone." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry I interrupted it." I looked at her. "You didn't interrupt it." She met my eyes. I said, "You finished it." She looked away. The fire made its sound. The fire had gotten low. I didn't build it back up. The night was warm enough. She said, "What do you call it? The thing I did, not leaving, waiting with him, knowing and not acting on it." I said, "I call it the thing that makes someone worth trusting." She was very still. I said, "A woman who stays when she knows it's not working, because leaving would cost the person she loves something they couldn't afford to lose. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of loyalty there is, because you paid for it in years and in knowing and in waiting." She held my eyes for a long moment. I looked away first. The canyon was quiet. The spring made its sound. We sat without talking for a long time, and it was not uncomfortable. Some people fill silence because they're afraid of it. She wasn't afraid of it. She sat in it the same way she sat in everything, fully present, doing the thing that needed doing, which in this case was just being there in the dark with the fire going low and the stars thick overhead and the canyon walls holding in the warmth of the day. On the fourth morning, before the sun was up, I heard a mule. I was on my feet before I was fully awake, which is a thing that happens when you've spent enough years being the kind of man who needs to be on his feet quickly. The sound came from the south end of the canyon, a mule's shuffle and the creak of a loaded cart. I went to the canyon mouth. He was a Swede, middle-aged, with a sunburned neck and a mild manner, and a gray mule pulling a freight cart, heading north toward Drummond's post. He looked at me across the distance with the careful assessment of a man who has been in this country long enough to know you look before you react. Then he looked at the camp behind me. I went back to Marin, who was awake and sitting up. "There's a man with a freight cart," I said. "He's heading toward Drummond's trading post about half a day north. He can take you." She looked at me. Something happened in her face that she kept still mostly, but not entirely. She said, "Can I have a few minutes before we flag him down?" I went out and told the man to take his time, water his mule. There was a woman here with a broken ankle who might need a ride. He said, of course, he'd be ready when she was. Marin was on her feet when I came back, her hand on the boulder for balance. She said, "Come with me to Drummond's." I looked at her. She said, "I know you have to go back. I know you have your band and your decisions and everything that's waiting for you. I know all of that." She looked at her hands, then at me. In 4 days I have talked to you more honestly than I have talked to anyone in 2 years, maybe longer, and you," she stopped, started again. "You said something to me last night that I have been thinking about all morning." "Which thing?" "That I'm not a woman who leaves, and that's not a flaw." She looked up. "Nobody has said that to me before. Frank didn't say it because it was useful to him. My sister would never say it because she thinks it's a limitation. You said it like it was just true, a fact about who I am. You said it the way you say everything." I said, "How do I say things?" She said, "Straight. You say them straight. Not unkindly, you say them the way they are, and then you leave them to do their own work." She looked at me. "I don't know if anyone has told you that you do that." "My wife did," I said, "once." Her face was very still. I said, "I'll come to Drummond's." Something settled in her. Not release exactly. She wasn't the kind of person who visibly released, but something became real that had been provisional. I said, "And then I'll go back. What I'm going back to, I've been out here deciding. I've decided. It took finding a boot in a creek bed to get me the rest of the way there, but I've decided." She said, "What did you decide?" I told her. All of it this time, not just the situation but the decision itself, what I was going to tell the men in suits and what I was going to ask for and what I was going to refuse. She listened the way she always listened, fully present, nothing held back. When I finished, she said, "That's right." Just those 2 words. She did not say it tentatively. She did not soften it with "I think" or "it seems" or "from what you've told me." She looked at me and she said "that's right" the way she said everything, flat and certain, and meaning it fully. I sat with that for a moment. I had told 31 people what I was going to do and they had trusted it. I had told the old men and they had accepted it mostly, and Hachin had said that it sounded like I had come to a place where I knew what I was, which was his way of agreeing. I had told my nephew, and he had said that's more than we've gotten in 2 years, and his face had said more than that. But this was different. She had no investment in the outcome. She had no people whose futures were tied to mine, no reason to want me to be right, nothing to gain from agreeing. She just listened, and then said that's right because she had looked at it from the outside, and that was what she saw. I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because it comes from seeing things clearly rather than from seeing things hopefully. Frank made decisions from hope. They weren't always wrong, hope is not always wrong, but they couldn't be argued with because they weren't based on what was real. What you just described is based on what's real. What can be done and what can be asked for and what those things are worth." She looked at me. "And because it puts your people's dignity first and their survival second, which means you understand that the dignity is actually part of the survival. If they lose that, you lose more than you saved." I looked at her for a long time. She said, "Go, get your horse." We broke camp together. She did what she could one-handed, her other hand on the wall or on me for balance, and I did the rest, and we had it packed in less time than I would have done it alone because she knew where everything went and she moved with the efficiency of someone who has always moved that way. No wasted motion, no drama, just the work. I had been in many camps over the years. I had broken camp with many people. There is a particular quality to breaking camp with someone who has shared it, a kind of closing, a recognition that whatever the camp was, it is now done and you are carrying it forward instead of leaving it behind. Usually that recognition is neutral, functional. You pack the things and you move. This felt different. Not sad exactly. More like the particular weight of finishing a thing that mattered and knowing you are finished with it even if what comes next is better. The canyon had been good to us. The spring and the walls and the stars and the fire and the long conversations in the dark. I would come back to it, probably. It was a good camp and I knew the country, but I would not come back to it the same way. I was not the same man who had ridden in here with his unfinished decision and his careful water rationing and his 47 years of keeping on. I was that man still, but something in him had moved. I looked at the hollow in the clay bank where she had been when I found her. The hollow was empty now, just rock and shadow, the imprint of a person who had pressed her hands flat against the stone and breathed. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went to get the horse. The Swede's name was Lars. He was a quiet man who asked the minimum questions and answered the ones we asked him fully and without embellishment, and his mule was a good animal who moved steadily on the canyon trail. We made Drummond's Post in the mid-afternoon. It was a low adobe building with a corral and a water trough, and a lean-to on the south side, where 3 horses stood out of the sun. Inside, there was a woman behind the counter named Bet who looked at Marin's ankle, and immediately became useful in the efficient, no-nonsense way of women, who have spent their lives in places where people occasionally arrive damaged. The Swede settled his accounts and went out back. Marin arranged for a room and a message sent to Calhoun Wells and something to eat. I watered the horse at the trough and sat at the plank table in the shade of the lean-to. She came out when she'd finished inside and lowered herself onto the bench across from me. She said, "The next freight run to Calhoun Wells is 6 days. I said, "Your sister will worry." "I'm sending word. She'll receive it in 2 days if the rider is reliable. She looked at me. Are you staying the night? Yes. She nodded once. Good. We ate at the plank table with Bet and an old man who appeared to live at Drummond's in a permanent way and had strong opinions about the dry spell that gripped this part of the territory. He shared those opinions throughout the meal with the thoroughness of a man who has been waiting for an audience and finally has one. Marin listened to him with complete seriousness, the way she listened to everything, and asked him questions that made him talk more. And I watched her do it and thought about what it was like to have that kind of attention given to you freely. After the meal, she said she was going in to sleep. Her body was still doing the work of coming back. She stood at the lean-to entrance and paused. She said, "Tack." I said, "Yes." Said, "When you go back north, when you sit down with those men in suits and tell them what you've decided, they're going to find someone who came to this in a canyon alone without anyone to agree with him. Someone who sat with it until it was clear. That's a different kind of certain than a man who decided because he had to." She looked at me. "I want you to know I see that, what it cost to get here. Not just the riding, the sitting with it until it was done. I want you to know someone saw that." She went inside. I sat at the plank table for a long time after. Bet had cleared away the dishes. The old man was asleep in his chair with his hat over his face. The horses in the corral were quiet. A lantern on the post outside made a small circle of yellow light that the moths were working at. I watched them for a while, the way they came at it again and again. There is something in that I have never been able to work out cleanly, whether it is foolishness or just the fact of what they are. I sat there and thought about what she'd said. I want you to know I see that, what it cost to get here. Not just the riding, the sitting with it until it was done. I had not known how much I needed someone to see it until she said it. That is the particular blindness of being the person everyone depends on. You stop noticing what you need because the machinery of being needed does not leave room for it. You fill your days with the requirements of the job and the job fills you back. And it is sustaining in its way. It is. But it is a different kind of sustaining than being seen by a person who has no requirement to see you. She had no requirement. She was the one who had been found. She was the one who had been brought in from the dark and set beside a fire and fed. By any accounting, she was the one who owed. She did not see it that way. I did not think she was the kind of person who kept that kind of ledger. I thought about the 4 years since Tehan Win died. The ways I had gotten smaller in them. Not in the work had stayed big, had if anything gotten bigger as the situation with the agency worsened and the decisions compounded. But in myself. In the part of me that was not the chief. I had let that part go quiet, and I had told myself it was grief, and that grief needed time, and that was true, but I had also been using the grief as a reason not to need anything from anyone. It was easier to be only what people needed. I sat there and thought about what she'd said, and about what my wife used to say, that I was the only man she'd ever met who could look at something hard and still figure out what it was worth. That I didn't make things better than they were, but I didn't make them worse either. I had not heard anything like it in 4 years. I left Drummond's before sunrise. I saddled the horse in the dark and checked the cinch and started north. The way I always leave places when I know that if I wait for more light, I'll find reasons to stay. I rode for a long time before the sky began to change. The horse moved easy. He had grain and rest behind him, and he wanted the open country. The flat here was wide and the grass short, and I could see a long way in every direction as the light came back, which was what I needed. The horizon does something for me that close country doesn't. It makes a man the right size inside what he's carrying. There is a reason men ride out when they need to think, and it is not only the solitude. It is the particular scale of the open country, which reminds you that what seems enormous when you are standing still in it is moving through something larger, and that what is moving through something larger is smaller than it felt, and that being smaller than it felt is not a bad thing but a true one. I have always done my best thinking on horseback. My uncle used to say that the motion is the point, that the body in motion keeps the mind from getting fixed on itself, and I think he was right, though I could not have said why until I was old enough to have spent enough years sitting still in rooms with papers on tables, and felt the particular grip of that kind of stillness on thought. The decision felt right on horseback. It had felt right in the canyon. It continued to feel right as the country opened up around me, and the sky went from black to dark blue to the first color of the coming sun. I had made the right decision. I had made it alone in a canyon with a spring making its sound, and a woman eating chokecherries one at a time had not made the decision for me, but had made it possible for me to hear what I had already decided. That was the thing she'd done. Not told me what to think, not argued, just listened fully and then said that sounds like you already know, which was the exact right thing because it was true. I thought about the decision. I turned it over the way you turn over a stone you're going to build with, checking the faces of it, making sure it'll bear weight. Every way I looked at it, it held. It had held in the canyon. It held in the daylight. It would hold in the room with the men in suits. I thought about 31 people waking up and going about the work of living with a trust in me that I had to keep earning. My nephew Kantschinla, 17 years old, and already showing the particular steady quality that would make him a good leader when his time came. The old men who had known my uncle and transferred their trust to me with the caution of people who had already had that trust broken too many times. The children who didn't know what any of it meant and were depending on us to make it mean something worth living inside. By midday I had crossed the first line of hills and the country changed, going from flat to rolling, and the grass was longer here and I could smell the difference in it. I stopped at a creek to let the horse drink. I drank too. The water was cold and tasted like iron and the hills. I looked south for a moment. Then I turned north. There was a reason. There had been a reason since a boot in a dry creek bed, but the reasons that matter are the ones that keep, not the ones that feel true in a canyon in the firelight, but the ones that feel true in the daylight going home. And this one kept. The hills closed around me going north, and the day lengthened and I rode. I reached the band late on the second day. The cook fires were going when I came over the last rise, and I could see the smoke in the early evening light, and the shapes of the lodges, and before I was all the way down the slope Kantschinla came out to meet me. He looked at me the way young men who are paying attention look at the older men they learn from, reading the face before anything else. He took the horse. I went in and sat with the old men. Hachin was there, who had been skeptical of this whole business from the beginning and had not been shy about saying so. I told them what I had decided. All of it, what I was going to say, what I was going to ask for, what I was not going to accept regardless of what they offered instead. The old men listened. A few had things to say and I let them say it, the full saying without cutting it short, because that mattered too. Hachin was quiet through most of it. At the end he sat for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in the old language, that it sounded like I had come to a place where I knew what I was. I said I thought so. He said nothing else, but he didn't argue. That night I slept a long straight sleep without turning, the first in months. In the morning, I started working on what I'd bring to the men in suits. It took 3 weeks to arrange the meeting. 2 weeks of that was back and forth through runners and one letter that went 3 times before it was answered. The government men moved at their own pace and expected you to wait, which was both a practical reality and a deliberate imbalance of power. I waited. I used the time. I talked to everyone I needed to talk to before I sat across that table, and I knew what I had and what they wanted and what was negotiable and what was not. Those 3 weeks were good work. Focused. The kind of work that does not feel like work because you can see exactly what you are building toward, and every day adds something. And at the end of the day, you can look at what you have and know it is more than you had that morning. I talked to 3 other men in that period. Men I knew. Men who had been through their own versions of this kind of arrangement, men who understood what the agency wanted and what it was willing to give and where the edges were. I did not tell any of them my full plan. I told each of them the pieces that were theirs to know, and they told me pieces of what they knew. And by the time I sat down across that table, I had a picture of the situation considerably more complete than what I'd had when I came back from the canyon. That is the work no one sees, the positioning, the information gathering, the specific labor of knowing what you are walking into before you walk into it. The men in suits thought they were managing a process. They were not wrong exactly, there was a process. But the process they thought they were managing was not the same one I was running. 3 weeks after I left Drummond's, I sat across a table from 2 men from the agency. One was nervous, a younger man with new boots who had not been doing this long enough to have learned to hide his discomfort when the person across the table didn't perform the expected deference. The other was the kind of man who has been doing his job so long that he stopped distinguishing between the people across the table and the problems those people represent. He moved papers with the efficiency of a man for whom papers were the point. I told them what I'd decided. I told them how it was going to be, what I would agree to and what I would ask for in return, and what I would not agree to regardless. I said it in the register I had worked on during those 3 weeks, a kind of language that the men in suits recognized and took seriously, not because it was their language, but because it was precise and unambiguous and left no room for the polite ambiguity they usually exploited. The nervous one looked as if he'd expected something easier. The efficient one went still, that particular quality of stillness that means a recalibration is happening. He said, "Chief Running Dog." "Tahakasunka," I said. He looked at me across the table. I looked back and did not move my eyes. He said, "This is considerably more than what we were authorized to." "Then get authorization," I said. "You have 2 weeks. Silence. He said, "2 weeks is." 2 weeks, I said. They took their 2 weeks. They came back. I got most of what I'd asked for. Not all, there were 2 things they couldn't or wouldn't give me, and I had known that before I walked in, and I had arranged alternatives for both of them in the weeks before the meeting, which the nervous one discovered a few days later when he came back with papers, and found that the 2 things I hadn't gotten from them I had already addressed through separate channels. He was not pleased. The efficient one looked briefly like a man seeing something he hadn't anticipated, not quite respect, but the thing that precedes it, the recalculation. I had seen it before, in smaller meetings, in conversations with men who had decided before they sat down what kind of man they were going to be dealing with. The recalculation is the moment they realize the man in front of them has been doing his own preparation, that he came in knowing things they didn't know he knew, that the table they thought they were running is actually a different table from the one he is running. I signed nothing that day. I said I would have my answer within a week. They said they would need their authorization within the same window. We shook hands across the table, the way you shake hands with men you are going to have to deal with again and need to leave on terms that allow for it, and I went out into the afternoon. I rode back with papers that meant something. It took most of the first day of riding to come down from the meeting, not from excitement, though there was satisfaction in it. It was more the particular decompression that happens when you have been holding a specific quality of readiness for a long time, and the thing you were ready for is finally finished. The body does not know immediately how to stop being ready. It keeps looking for the threat. By the second morning I had come down and was just riding. Just the horse and the country and the sky and the slow unspooling of miles. I thought about Marin. I had not let myself think about her during the weeks of preparation, not in any specific way, not in the way of imagining or anticipating. It would have been a distraction, and I could not afford distractions. But now, riding home with the work done, I let myself think about her. I thought about her standing at the gate in the lamplight. About her hand touching the back of mine once, quick, the way she touched things directly and then let go. I thought about what she had said. I told myself to be practical about whether you would come. I was very bad at being practical about it. The country went past. The grass was longer now than it had been a month ago, the season moving, the air changing slightly in the mornings. I rode through it and thought about a woman who could not argue Frank Voss out of his belief because you cannot argue with hope, could only wait, and had chosen not to leave because leaving was not who she was, and who had paid for that with years, and who came out of it not bitter but clear. There is a kind of clarity that suffering produces in certain people. Not everyone, most people's suffering makes smaller, but certain ones come out of it clean down to what they actually are, without the extra they had been carrying, and what is left is harder and truer than what they were before. She was like that. I could see it in the way she talked about her husband, not with anger, not with the performance of forgiveness, just with the plain accuracy of someone who had looked at a thing honestly and knew what it was. I wondered if I was like that. I thought maybe I was. My wife's death had taken things from me and left things behind, and the things left behind were, I thought, the better things, or at least the truer ones. Kante Chinla rode out to meet me on the rise above camp as he had before, and we rode in together, and I told him what had happened. He said, in English, he'd been working at it, getting better at it than he let on. He said, "That's more than we've gotten from them in 2 years." Yes. What changed? I thought about the boot, about a hollow in a red clay bank, about 2 days without water, about a woman who pressed her hands flat against stone and breathed until someone heard her. I said, I went and sat with it until I knew what I knew. He was quiet on the horse beside me. Knew what? That what I was deciding had already been decided. I just needed somewhere quiet enough to hear it. He thought about that for a while. That doesn't make sense. No, I said. Not until you're old enough for it to. He made a face that said he was going to have an opinion about being told he wasn't old enough for something, and then he let it go, which was the right thing. He was learning. We rode into camp. The weeks after the signing were full, good full, the kind of full that a man who has been uncertain for a long time finds almost disorienting, when the uncertainty lifts and the actual work begins. There were things to build on the new arrangement, things to put in place, the particular detailed labor of making an agreement mean what you said it would mean when the other party would always prefer it to mean something slightly less. I did that work. I did it well, I think. I slept better those months than I had in years. The decisions still came. They would always come, as long as I was the one people looked to, but they came into a different kind of clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't feel like certainty so much as readiness. 2 months after the meeting, I had reason to ride south. There were always reasons to ride south. There was a man at the Drummond's post who received mail for the band when runners weren't practical. There was a transaction at the land office in Calhoun Wells that needed a signature. There were 3 or 4 things, plausible and real, that I added to no particular urgency. I rode south. I went to Drummond's first. Lars was there with his freight cart, taking on a load. We nodded at each other with the acknowledgement of men who have done something together that was unremarkable to him and significant to me. Bet had a parcel of letters that I gathered and put in the saddlebag. Then I rode to Calhoun Wells. It was a bigger settlement than I'd expected. Not a city, still a frontier town, still raw-edged, the kind of place that had ideas about what it was going to be and was still in the early work of becoming it. There was a main street with storefronts, a mill at the east end, a church that looked recent, houses going up at the west end where the street widened out toward better ground. I rode through the main street slowly, looking at the place. Every settlement has a particular quality that tells you what it thinks it is and what it is actually becoming, which are sometimes the same thing and more often not. Calhoun Wells thought it was going to be substantial. Whether it was right about that I could not tell yet, but the ambition was visible in the widths of the lots, and the quality of the building materials, and the church that was clearly bigger than the current congregation required. There was a grain store on the south side of the main street. I looked at it as I passed. The man who ran it was visible through the window, talking to a customer, a big-shouldered man in a clean shirt. He was unremarkable in the way that reliable men are often unremarkable. I looked at him for a moment and thought of what Marin had said about stability and reliability and boring, and I kept my face where it needed to be. I asked at the dry goods store whether they knew of Hilda Garrett. The woman behind the counter said, of course, everyone knew Hilda Garrett. She was the one who organized the school fund and wouldn't let anyone forget about it. She pointed me west. The house was a white frame building with a kitchen garden along one side, very tidy, and there was a woman in the garden who looked up when I came through the gate. She was older than Marin, broader in the shoulders, with the same directness but worn differently. Where Marin's directness was watchful and gathered, this woman's was immediate, outward, aimed. She said, "Can I help you?" I said I was looking for Marin Voss, that I'd met her on the road some months back. She looked at me for a long, assessing moment. Something in her face shifted. She called into the house. I heard movement inside, the sound of someone coming through the house with a particular quality of pace, quick, but not running, the particular pace of someone who has heard a name they weren't certain they'd hear again. Marin came to the door. She was wearing a dark green dress and her hair was pinned differently from the canyon. She was moving well, the ankle had healed. I could see that in the way she stood, though there was still a slight care in how she set her weight on the right side. She looked rested. She looked like herself. She saw me. She said, "Tack." I said I had business in town. Something moved in her face that she kept mostly still. She held it, put it somewhere, let out the simpler version. She said to her sister, "Hilda, this is Tahaka Sunka. He found me when I was lost." A pause. "He brought me back." Hilda looked at me with the look of a woman putting several things together at once. Then she looked at her sister. Then she said, "I'll put coffee on," and went inside with the efficiency of a person who has made up their mind and is not wasting time on it. Marin came through the gate. She stood in front of me. She had to look up slightly. I am taller than her by a head, and standing here on level ground it was different from the canyon where I'd mostly been at her level or crouching. She looked up without self-consciousness. She said, "How did it go? The men in suits." "I got most of what I asked for." Her face settled. Something in her went to a particular quality of stillness that I had come to understand was her version of satisfaction. She said, "Of course you did." I said, "You don't know what I asked for." She said, "Whatever it was, you asked for it because it was right, and you weren't going to be argued out of it, so of course you got most of it." She looked at me directly. "The most of it was enough, wasn't it?" "Yes." She held my eyes. I said, "You told me someone saw what it cost to get there. I want you to know I've been carrying that." She was very still. I said, "It's different being seen, when you've been the one seeing for a long time. When your job is to see things clearly for other people, and there's not usually anyone doing it for you. I stopped. "It's different." She said quietly, "Yes, it is." She looked at my hand, at the side of my hand where she'd touched it briefly at the canyon mouth when the Swede and his mule were waiting. She had touched it once, quick. She hadn't made anything of it, but I had been carrying that too. She said, "Come inside. Hilda is going to interrogate you completely. She has already decided you are interesting, which means you will not get away easily." I said, "I've dealt with government men. I can manage a thorough woman." She laughed. The real one, the quick one that surprised her, that she covered for a half-second before she let it go. She said, "I'll remember that when she's 3 questions in, and you're looking for the door." We went inside. Hilda's husband Garrett was a solid man who worked at the land office, and had a handshake that meant something. He looked at me the way a man looks when he has made up his mind about something, but wants to verify it with the evidence in front of him. And after about 10 minutes of dinner conversation, he seemed to have gotten whatever he needed and relaxed into being just a man at his own table. He and I talked after dinner about the territory and the changes coming, and he had thoughts worth listening to. He had a perspective on the land office business that was useful to me, a view from the inside of how those decisions were being made and what was driving them, and I filed it carefully without making obvious that I was filing it. He seemed to understand that I was doing that and did not mind. He was a man who understood that information had uses, and that useful men were worth talking to. He was the kind of man who did what he said he'd do, which is rarer than people think. Marin sat across the table from me and listened to the conversation, and occasionally said something that cut directly to the center of what we were talking about. And the men, me and Garrett, would stop and acknowledge it and incorporate it, and that was just how the conversation went. Hilda watched all of it with the expression of a woman who has been watching her sister for 30 years and is updating a long-held assessment. When I got up to go, it was late. The stars were out. Marin walked me to the horse. She said, "I'm staying in Calhoun Wells. My sister wants me here and I've decided I want to be here, which is different from just staying because someone wants you too. You found things here." "Some. There's a property east of town, good soil, water that runs in dry years. I've been talking to the land office about it. Garrett has been helpful. He says the price is right, and the previous owner gave it up for reasons that had nothing to do with the land itself." I said, "You could build something on a property like that." She looked at me. "That's what I thought." I said, "What would you grow?" She said, "Wheat first. The soil is right for it and there's a market, then maybe flax, and I want to keep some cattle, not many, 6 or 8 to start, but cattle." She was looking past me at the street at the west end where the ground opened up, seeing something I couldn't see. "I want to build something that knows what it is, something that makes sense of the ground it's standing on." I said, "You'll do that." She looked at me. "Just like that, you'll do that. You could read the rock when your husband couldn't. You could see the vein. You know what you're looking at when you look at ground. You'll do it." She was very still. I said, "Marin." She looked at me. I took her hand. Not quickly, deliberately, giving her time to know what was happening. I held her hand, those wide, capable hands that had pressed flat against the stone in the hollow, that had gone through a saddlebag with such methodical care, that had held a coil of rope while she told me the truth about her marriage. I held her hand and she didn't pull it back. She let me hold it and she looked at me with those brown eyes in the starlight. I said, "I found a boot in a dry creek bed and I stopped, and then I heard you breathing." She waited. I said, "I think I was ready to hear something I hadn't been hearing." She looked at me. The almost smile came and then something beyond it, something that had been waiting. She said, "What were you ready to hear?" I said that the keeping on matters. Even when it goes on alone, even when nobody's watching and nobody knows, that the keeping on is the thing, not the catching. My name is about that. My father gave me a name about that. I understood it in that canyon. She looked at my hand holding hers, then up at me. She said, "You heard me breathing. For 2 days you breathed toward something. You didn't know what. You just kept going." She closed her hand around mine. She said, "I'm glad it was you." The lamplight from the house was behind her, and the stars were very thick overhead, the way they get out here when the town is small enough that the dark between the buildings is actual dark. She was holding my hand and looking at me, and she was not performing anything, just there, just all the way present. I said, "When can I come back?" She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Come when you have reason, come when you don't." I looked at her. She said, "I have been very practical my entire life. I have made the right decision about nearly everything by being practical, And I was trying to be practical about this, about you, about whether you would come back and what that meant and what I should allow myself to think about it. I was doing quite well at it for the first 2 weeks. She paused. And then I was not. I said, what happened at 2 weeks? She said, I dreamed about the canyon. I said, what part? She said, the spring, the sound of it at night, and you on the other side of the fire. She looked at me. That was all, just that. The spring and the fire and you across it. But I woke up and the house was quiet, and I lay there for a long time thinking about how quiet it was. I said, Marin. She looked at me. I said, I am not a man with easy words for the inside things. I know. But I have been carrying the same canyon. For 2 months. I have done the work, I have made the decision. I have sat with the old men and the agency men, and I have done all of it. And underneath all of it has been a canyon in the dark and a spring and a fire. She was very still. I said, and a woman who said that's right and meant it. And a woman who said I see that. And a woman who had 2 days without water and did not stop breathing. She closed her hand around mine. I looked at her. She said, I told myself to be practical about whether you'd come. I was very bad at being practical about it. I said, 6 weeks maybe. I'll have business this direction. She nodded, her hand was still in mine. I said, that property east of town, when you've talked to the land office further. Yes. I know something about ground that holds water in dry years. I know what to look for, when you're ready to walk it. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her settled in the way it had settled in the canyon when I'd said I'd come to Drummond's, a thing going from provisional to real. She said, when I'm ready to walk it. I let go of her hand. She stayed close for a moment and then she stepped back. I got on the horse. She stood at the gate and I went to the end of the lane and turned, and she was there in the lamplight from the house window, still, watching. I rode north. The country at night is its own thing out here. The dark between one place and the next is a country of its own, with its own rules and sounds. I have been riding through it all my life, the nights of this country, and I know them the way you know a person who has been in your life so long you have stopped cataloging their particular qualities and just know them. The smell of the grass at different hours. The way the rock holds the cold differently than the ground. The sound the wind makes when it changes direction, which it does sometimes in the hours before dawn, swinging around from south to north as if it lost interest in one thing and found something better. I rode through the dark, and I let the horse set the pace, and I thought about nothing in particular for a long time, which is something I have had to learn. For most of my adult life, I have filled every hour of quiet with the work of being chief, with the decisions and the calculations and the long forward-looking that the job requires. I had not learned until the years since Tehan Win died that the quiet itself was a thing worth having, that if you sat inside it long enough, it did something for you that the working could not do. She used to make me sit with her sometimes, just sit. Not talking, not planning, just present together in a quiet room or a quiet evening. I had found it difficult at first. I was not made for stillness in the way she was, and I would last about 10 minutes before some thought about something that needed doing would surface, and I would say something about it, and she would look at me with that look, and I would try to go back to the quiet. I was better at it now. 4 years of having no one to be quiet with had, paradoxically, taught me to be quiet better. The quiet had become something I carried with me instead of something I needed another person to hold open. I rode north, the grass pale under the moon, the hills ahead still dark, the horse moving easy under me with the confidence of an animal that knows the way home. I thought about 31 people sleeping, about Kantichinla keeping watch the way he'd learned to, about the papers in my pack and what they'd cost to get, and what they meant, and how much work was still ahead to make them mean what they were supposed to mean. I thought about a boot, a spur still spinning, about breathing, About the way a name that your father gives you can take 47 years to become what it was meant to be. I am not the elk. I am the dog. I am the one who keeps going, who stays with the thing, who doesn't stop because it's hard or because it's long or because no one is watching. My uncle knew it. My wife knew it. I had come to know it in the years since she died, when the keeping on was all I had, and it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been everything. But I had not known until recently that the keeping on could also bring you somewhere. Not just through, somewhere. 5 weeks later, not 6, because the reason I went south found me a week before I planned to go looking for it. A piece of business that genuinely needed settling, and that I did not invent. I was in Calhoun Wells for the second morning when she found me at the dry goods store. She had walked from the house on the West End, moving well now, the ankle healed enough that you would not know about it unless you were watching for it. She was carrying a piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of the East property, which she handed to me without preamble. She said, "Garrett got me the survey. It's bigger than I thought. 40 acres, with water rights to the creek that runs along the south edge." I looked at the map. The survey lines, the creek, the elevation marks that told you which way the ground ran. I said, "Can you walk that far on the ankle?" She said, "The question is whether you have time before you ride back." I said, "I have time." We walked to the East property. It took about 20 minutes from the edge of town, on a good road that turned into a track and then into open ground. The property marker was a cedar stake with a white rag tied to it, and from there we walked in, Marin reading the survey against the ground, orienting herself, and I walked alongside her and let her lead because this was her reading to do. I stood on the east edge of that piece of land and watched a woman walk the ground like she could hear what it was saying. She moved carefully, her weight balanced well, the ankle mostly healed. She crouched at intervals and picked up handfuls of soil and let them run through her fingers and looked at what was left in her palm. She looked at the sky, at the way the ground ran, at the particular quality of the vegetation in the low places. She moved like someone reading. I hung back and let her read. There is a quality of attention that people bring to the things they are genuinely good at that is different from ordinary attention. It is slower and also faster, if that makes sense, slower in the way that they move through the work, taking time with each piece, not rushing, and faster in the way the understanding arrives when they look at something, the almost instant recognition that comes from enough practice that the pattern registers before the mind has time to process it consciously. She had that quality with the ground. She stopped at one point and knelt and pressed both palms flat against the earth, which made me think of the hollow in the clay bank and the way she had pressed her palms flat against the stone. The gesture was the same. The intention was different, but the gesture was the same. Her hands flat and her weight behind them and her full attention on what she was touching, receiving information through her palms that she would interpret through everything she knew. She looked up at me once while she was working, not to say anything, just checking the way she did, noting where I was and what I was doing, adding it to her picture of the situation. Then she went back to the ground. After a while she stood up and walked south along the low place, slowly, looking at the vegetation. The grasses there were slightly different, slightly richer, the kind of difference you would not see unless you were looking for it. She was looking for it. She stopped at a particular spot. She crouched down and took a long time with it, pressing the soil in her palm, breaking a clod, looking at what was inside it. Then she looked up at me. She said, "Here." I said, "Yes." She looked at the hills to the east, and at the way the ground ran down to the low place that you would miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. She said, "The water pools here in a dry year, below the surface, not far." Not far. She stood up. She dusted her hands on the front of her dress. She looked at the land around us, what it could be, what it was already in the part of her that knew how to read it. Then she looked at me. She said, "I think this is right." I said, "So do I." She stood there in the afternoon light, that wide, capable presence of her, and she was smiling now, fully, the real one, the one that surprised her, and this time she didn't cover it. And the light was golden and long, the way it gets in this country at the end of the afternoon, and the land went out around us in all directions with the particular generosity that land has when you finally understand what it's offering you. I was 47 years old with the years behind me and whatever years still ahead, the decisions still coming and still mine to make. But standing on that ground with a woman beside me who saw things straight and said them straight, who had pressed her hands against stone in a dark hollow and breathed toward something for 2 days without knowing what was coming. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, one brief solid lean, the weight of her against my side, her face turned toward the land. We stood like that and looked at what she was going to build. 40 acres with water rights. Wheat first, she had said, then flax, 6 or 8 cattle to start, something that knows what it is. I thought about that phrase, something that knows what it is. I had been thinking about it since she said it, the way you think about a phrase when it names something you recognized but had not had the word for. I knew something about building things that knew what they were. The band knew what it was, even diminished, even after everything. We knew what we were. That was what I had been protecting all those months of papers and agency men and the long, slow negotiations. Not the land exactly, not the headcount, but the knowing of what we were. She understood that. Without me explaining it, without the context that would make it obvious, she had understood it and said so. That puts your people's dignity first and their survival second, which means you understand that the dignity is actually part of the survival. Yes, that was exactly it. I looked at the land in front of us, the 40 acres that would become something under her hands, and I thought about the years ahead, and they felt, for the first time in a long time, like something to move toward rather than something to manage. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, one brief solid lean, the weight of her against my side, her face turned toward the land. We stood like that and looked at what she was going to build. The dog does not catch the elk. My father was right about that. But some days you stop and you look around at where the running has brought you, and a woman who knows how to read what the ground is telling you is standing beside you with the afternoon light on her face, and the land is still and the sky is enormous, and it is enough. More than enough. Everything.